So let me just begin with not where we started from, but something that led us to converge on how to tell the story that we want to tell in this report. And this is a story from a country that was a lower middle income country, it's still a lower middle income country, that had very decent growth performance over the longest run, 5%, that had a rather intensive social focus on its public expenditure. In some, and I'm not going to go over all the figures, a country that looked good on paper, and like good on paper by a number of elements. And I don't know if any of you can guess what that country is, but so it might not be a surprise. Greece. Oh, yeah. 3% inflation in Greece, but maybe. This is actually, or this was Tunisia. This was Tunisia back before the spring of last year. And what this tells us is that we're looking at the world with some kind of goggles that include a number of models and data collecting exercises and analysis, and we're missing something. We're clearly missing something. Now, this may not be what we're missing, but this is a sign that we're actually missing something. What you have here are, for a number of countries that are selected purposefully, but not necessarily representatively, we have GDP per capita growth. We have growth in mean years of schooling as a way of showing human development performance. And we have the changes in life satisfaction in the last 5 years of the last decade. And we tend to think, well, first we look at GDP, then we go, oh, let's look at human development to complete and go beyond GDP. And neither of those things seems to work. And actually, Tunisia was doing, if not admirably, it was doing rather well in both of those counts. In particular, in human development, Tunisia is a country where you have pretty much universal primary enrollment in education. So actually having 3% increase in mean years of schooling per annum is quite significant. But at the same time, there was a massive, what this doesn't show is that life satisfaction tends to be rather volatile, but there was a massive fall in life satisfaction in the run-up to the events of the Arab Spring. You had something similar in Thailand, where performance was maybe a bit more sluggish in the years before, and where the political crisis has dragged on for longer. Maybe to give you a point of comparison of what this life satisfaction fall means. So life satisfaction is measured with polls, and this data here in particular comes from the Gallup World Poll, is the average of responses to a question, how happy, how would you rate your life in a scale from 0 to 10? The size of the fall in Tunisia is the same as the difference in the average life satisfaction of people who are full-time employed and the average of the life satisfaction of people who are unemployed. So the hit that happiness in Tunisia took in the run-up to the Arab Spring is of the same magnitude as what would happen in a country if everyone is suddenly unemployed, in the terms of personal well-being, regardless of what happens to the economy. So this is something that's large, and that's the message we want to convey. So this is not necessarily to say we should be looking at life satisfaction instead of GDP or on top of GDP, but clearly we want to add something to a way of thinking, and in particular to a way of thinking about development. So that was the motivation, well, the exposed motivation for the report, because it's happened after the report was written, but it's a motivation of why we want to look at things from a slightly different way. So let me begin with what the report wants to say. So the main messages of the report is first that even though now the report was written after a period of long-term growth in developing countries, and I think even today, by and large, the news on development from the last 10 to 20 years are good. And I'll show you some evidence of that. But even if there's more uncertainty now, now is when you should be thinking about using some of the resources that have been accumulated in the last 10 years in a lot of countries to foster social cohesion, to foster shared societies. I would not claim, and I think we don't do that in the report, we want to be careful about that these things come cheap. That they don't. They require purposeful action. It may be worth it in the medium to long run. It will not be cheap. And so the fact that there are resources that are available to put in place policies that will actually foster social cohesion, that will foster a sense of common identity and belonging is important. The second element is that rapid growth, as good as it is and as much as it can bring these resources in, can also disrupt societies. It can disrupt societies through its international manifestations. I think the rise in food prices and the riots that led to is a clear example. But we also have examples that come from changes in inequality, from labor, which I think Steve will touch on later on. It also does that through domestic effects, in the sense that rapid growth, the proceeds of rapid growth are seldom equally shared. And they're seldom equally shared across the income distribution, but also across groups. And that can create in itself tensions that can lead to conflict. And the last point is that from here we could draw on a long menu of policies. And one thing we realized, and this towards the end, I think in part thanks to our involvement with the Club of Madrid, is that it's not only about what you do, but how you do it. That the involvement of marginalized groups in the policymaking process is almost as important as the end product, and actually improves the end product. It makes policies more relevant, in particular more locally relevant, where civic participation is maybe easier to foster. So in the next, I guess, 15 minutes or so, I want to go over these 5 points. First, tell you a bit what we call shifting wealth, show you the fact that we think there's an opportunity that should be taken here. Second, highlight some of the challenges that emerge from what I just saw on the life satisfaction, but that go a bit beyond that and have to do with the distributions of income, with the persistence of intergroup inequalities in some countries. Third, and this is the part that I think might be more relevant for our discussions, I'll show you some thinking about how social cohesion and trust, both between individuals and across groups, can help increase the fiscal capacity of states. Fourth, go over some of the policies that we think are important, and especially on some thinking about how policies should change if you actually want to foster cohesive or shared societies. And finally, and maybe I'll start with that to show that this discussion does matter. So the report is out and we have 260 pages that are now immutable for eternity, but we're actually working on developing a tool that is based on this work that will go to countries to assess how they can alter their policies in order to have better outcomes in this sense, so in the sense of actually shared societies. And that is something that is very much on the making. And so I'm very much looking for comments that will definitely help us improve that and make it more relevant. So the first thing is what has happened to the world in the last 20 years in terms of growth. And so let me be extremely quick here. This is the countries in red. I think you can forget about the other ones. The countries in red are countries that grow twice as fast as OECD in per capita terms per annum. So in the 1990s, I think there were 12 of them. And you see China, but there's a bunch of small countries that are benefiting from growth in China, around China, and then there are a couple of countries that are a bit peculiar, like Chile and so on. But by and large, the 1990s are yet another lost decade. And what happens in the 2000s is that 83 countries grow twice as fast as OECD. Now, of course, it helps that OECD in the 2000s does pretty poorly. But even if we take the same bar as in the 90s, we'd had about 43 countries, 49 countries that lift that bar. So there is growth, there is widely shared and long-term growth over a decade. And in fact, what this doesn't show is that in a lot of countries, this growth is actually picking up in the second part of the decade. So there's a clear opportunity, and this has to do with the new geography of growth, and this is what we call shifting wealth. It also has to do with deeper transformations of the world economy, I think also impinge on what happens within countries and between groups, in terms of what happens in financial markets, who and in what country is financing development in other countries. And the rise of China is particularly important there, but you also have emerging finance from countries like Brazil, who's investing across the region. That leads to also higher commodity prices, of which a lot of countries in Africa in particular are benefited. There's a lot to do also with better management of macroeconomic policy in a lot of these countries. Now, one of the things that this means is that there are more resources for development in these countries. This is one example, is fiscal revenue to GDP across the same groups of countries. So converging countries are these countries that are growing twice as fast as OECD in red. And in those countries, fiscal revenues actually go up by about 30% in terms of the percentage. So that's quite significant. It's not getting to levels of, so in OECD, this number is about 30, 33. But it's also not the 12, 13, 14 you have, for example, some Central American countries. So we're not necessarily arguing in the report for a very state-led agenda, but at the same time, it's very clear that it's so much you can do with 20% of GDP in your budget. And this is one part of the story. Of course, there are resources that do not go through the state. In the same period, there was also massive increases in FDI, which actually recovered even after the crisis. There were increased remittances. There was a buildup of reserves. So really, there's a sense that these resources are available. There's also greater uncertainty, which is one of the reasons we have this buildup of resources. But there is the possibility of using this for purposeful action to foster more shared societies. Now, why is this also a challenge? Well, the changes in the distribution the income distribution that this entails are quite large. With some projections are trying to figure out how many people are in middle classes. And this is a very rough definition of middle classes where we're capturing everyone between 10 and 100 US dollars in PPP terms per day. So this is a middle class that can afford to buy durable goods. This is the middle class that played a role in the development, in the political development of European countries. Now, today, about half of these people are in emerging economies. Now, with these projections were made in the middle of the crisis, but they're actually rather optimistic. But with those projections that assume a certain path of convergence, by 2013, about 80% of those people will be there. So it's about 4 billion people. Now, the question, and this is an interpretation of what we've seen in the Arab Spring, for example, is whether this middle class is actually a class in a more sociological sense, but also whether it's going to change the politics of these countries through their demands, through their aspirations that are no longer only anchored in the country settings, but actually go beyond, in particular thanks to the internet and thanks to increased connectivity across the world. The second challenge is that we have increases in inequality, and I didn't want to go back in there because I think Steve's going to talk about that. But in a number of countries, group inequality is actually combined with what we call vertical inequalities, such as wider distribution of outcomes, wider distribution of income, in determining the state of affairs. And one quite striking example, and there are many, so this is a bit of an outlier, is South Africa, because if you look at the income distribution for South Africa, it's one of the few countries where it looks clearly bimodal. What does that mean? It means if you look at the income distribution, which is on the left, and which is pretty much like a histogram, you have two paths. You would have two peaks. Now, once you disentangle self-declared ethnic groups, those peaks disappear, and what you have is actually a different distribution for African and colored people, and a different one for white. The same thing, or a very similar thing, applies in a lot of countries if we distinguish rural from urban. Now, it's important to try and get the distinctions right, and sometimes ethnic group is a clear identity distinction that helps you get at what is a relevant group. Sometimes it is not so clear what the relevant groups are, whether they're ethnic, whether they're more geographic, which of the many identities that people have are actually going to have the potential for conflict or to endure. In South Africa, what was striking, and this was particularly true in the mid-90s, is that on top of this, you had social expenditure that was not quite regressive, but not very progressive. And you can see so what you have on the right are, in real terms, the per capita expenditures across the income quantiles. You can see that the bottom in 95 received a bit more, but then it was pretty much flat. And what that meant in practice is that you were benefiting parts of the income distribution towards the top, which in turn also reinforces some of the group inequalities because you're not doing much to redress historical group inequalities. Now, one word on what we mean by social cohesion and what we're talking about. We use a triangle to remember to talk about three things rather than to make any deep point. And we have the view of social cohesion that goes maybe a bit what's beyond turn and that has a lot of points of contact with the concept of shared societies that the Club of Madrid uses. In fact, in the report, we define not social cohesion, but cohesive societies. And we define cohesive societies not as societies where something happens, but as societies that do things. So societies that foster inclusion, societies that foster common identities and a common sense of purpose, and societies where there is, that create opportunities for mobility. And I think in that sense, even though we might not use the same terms, we're actually quite close in what we mean. Maybe the big difference is we never focus only on intergroup inequalities. If anything, we go the other way. So let me now turn to a tax issue. When one of the important results we have when trying to figure out, okay, so how does it change politics and how does it change policy if you want to foster social cohesion, is that we found that with higher trust, so trust among people increases the capacity of states to collect taxes. And the capacity of state to collect taxes then can increase the capacity of state to foster what we call fiscal legitimacy. By fiscal legitimacy, we mean the sense that citizens have that their taxes will be put to good use, which leads them to actually willingly contribute to taxation, but more generally to be citizens. And so what we find is that when there's higher trust between people, then tax evasion, for example, is less acceptable. So this shows, and this is true across a wide set of countries. This is data from the World Value Survey. What's more remarkable is that, and I'm not going to show you regression data, but what's more remarkable is that this is also true across individuals. So when you use individual level data, people who are more trusting are also less likely to evade or to condone tax evasion. And the effect can be pretty large. In the 10% of countries where trust is lowest, about 40%, where trust is higher, about 40% think that tax evasion is never justified. But in those countries with high trust, then a large majority of people think tax evasion is never justified. There's always a fringe of about 10 to 15% of people in any country that will think that you can justify tax evasion. But what happens is really in the middle of the distribution, in the bulk of them. Now in turn, this is a bit less strong. In turn, better taxation actually leads to higher revenues, and that's not always true. You can see that in richer countries, and you have the Nordics there and Italy and so on, in richer countries when you start increasing the size of the state, and some people actually, tax morale is just the willingness to pay tax. So tax morale on the vertical axis is the willingness to pay tax. So you can see that here at the right, here on the right, in OECD, in richer OECD countries, as the size of state gets bigger, people are less willing to contribute. But once you include developing countries, and we use comparable data on tax revenues, which is not always easy to get by for Latin America here, then you can see that at lower levels of development, at lower sizes of the state, tax morale actually increases with the size. And what we interpret that as the states having a greater capacity to deliver, and therefore actually generating buying from individual groups. And maybe a last thing. This is for more technically minded. When you actually control for a bunch of things, this still holds. And what we did here is, instead of just looking at the size of the state, we looked at an index that measures tax effort, which is, if you like, the capacity of countries to collect tax given their economic structures. So it's not so much the share of taxes to GDP, but it's really the share of taxes to GDP if you were in a country that has this GDP per capita and this share of agriculture and a bunch of other structural parameters. And we find also across countries, countries where there is higher trust relative to their level of development, there are also countries that are more able to collect taxes. Now, what does that mean for policy? And I'll start with taxation, but maybe just first a couple of more general points. First, I think we firmly believe policies can make a difference, in particular with the income distribution. But there are also a number of other areas where policies need to change to foster social cohesion. Second, it's an ambitious agenda, and that's what I was saying before, referring to the fact that you need to finance this. This doesn't necessarily come cheaply. When we talk to developing country partners, sometimes they're a bit afraid of what this means. Does it mean that we don't do poverty reduction? No, it means you do poverty reduction and all of these things. And it also means that you do poverty reduction in a different way, because you have to take into account whether you're reinforcing or even generating group inequalities by your means of action. So it is poverty reduction plus, and plus what? Plus including the middle classes, many of which are vulnerable, many of which work informally in the decision-making process and as objects of policy as well. And it means an inclusive way of doing policy. So one of the ways in which we like to show that policies can make a difference is this picture that shows inequality before taxes and transfers and after taxes and transfers for OECD and for a bunch of Latin American countries. Now, the example is a bit extreme because Latin American countries have high inequality, but what's more remarkable is if you look at inequality before the state intervenes, as it's determined by market incomes in the little squares, yeah, Latin America is more unequal than OECD, but not that much. So what makes a difference, and what makes a huge difference, is the intervention of the tax and transfer system. Out of what happens in OECD countries, on the right, about 2/3 comes from transfers, about 1/3 from taxation. And out of what comes from transfers, most of that reduction in inequality comes through actions that lead to reduced vulnerability in people. So a lot of what's happening there is actually social pensions and unemployment benefits. So these are policies that these are not cheap policies, as I said before, but also they're manageable policies for countries, for middle-income countries that have the state capacity to intervene. Now, one of the things we also think that matters, as I was saying before, is looking at what happens in the middle of the income distribution and also intervening there. And this is just an example from Brazil. What you have in the left is a growth incidence curve, and that's a big word for saying shows the growth rates of incomes of people when you order them by their place in the distribution. So the zeros are the poorest people in Brazil at the beginning of the century, and the hundreds are the richest people. And when usually people look at this type of graphs, they're just looking at, is this going upwards or downwards? And if it's going downwards, it means that the poor are getting richer faster than the rich. And that's a good thing. And actually, in the case of Brazil, that has led to, there's a lot of literature and a lot of talk about how Brazil intervened to reduce poverty and how well they did, and they did very well. And you can see that what happens here at the left, they did very, very well. What we thought was very interesting when looking at this graph was what happens at the middle. Now remember, these are relative changes. So for people who are in this middle, that's actually in absolute terms probably more than what's happening at the bottom. So the improvement in the lives of people who are close to that is actually a way of purposefully buttressing the middle classes so that you create a sense of ownership that is actually housed there. There are many reasons why that happens, but one of the reasons is the change in minimum wage policy across, during this period under the Lula administration, pretty much, where you have a gradual but quite important increase in minimum wages that was done carefully, because otherwise it could have affected aggregate employment outcomes, but that had a massive effect. So not only this is not about minimum wage is the great thing to do, although maybe they are. It is more about there are policy instruments that are available to countries that can go beyond the poverty reduction agenda and that actually have an important effect not only on incomes, but also on having people be part of the same system. And it is part of what I guess we could call economic citizenship that actually goes just maybe beyond the Bill of Rights into putting in practice the sense of belonging to a society and actually turning that into policy and into exchange. In what follows, and I think I'll skip a couple of these for time, I had 3 examples of policy areas where this makes a difference. And I'm going to only, I think, talk about fiscal policy, right now what I said before. These two the 2 income distribution slides, I think, tell you that you can create more equal opportunities through more distribution. You can also create them through better distribution. And that, clearly one thing I have in mind is very wide-ranging subsidies, like fuel and food subsidies that are very popular in certain countries, in particular in Northern Africa, for example, go not in the majority, but to a large degree, go to the rich. And you can probably do better than that. The second point is we find that there's this virtuous cycle. So it's more than, I was saying at the beginning, we looked at things from growth to social cohesion, and if you want to look at things from shared societies to economic performance. And we find, at least in fiscal policy, not necessarily in all of the other areas, is that there's a virtuous cycle there that's waiting to be kickstarted. That's better expenditure actually leads to increasing trust. And increasing trust and increasing a sense of common identity actually leads to greater fiscal capacity and so on and so forth. I think the big question is there, where do you begin? And we put forward a couple of examples, but I think it's very open. The first is stronger and accountable and transparent tax administration. And you might hear that a lot in building government capacity and so on. But tax administration in particular, I think it's critical for this. And tax administration is usually a relatively small administration. It's actually relatively easy to professionalize and render transparent. So this is not about, change all of your governance and it will work. It's really a small part of governance reform. But of course, the second part is maybe a bit more difficult, is beginning by the spending side. Fiscal policy is always both sides. And I think what this tells you is that you have to look at policies from a more holistic way. Improving the quality of public policies to begin with, the public service to begin with, is also a way of enhancing trust before you actually start spending more. So we think you can also do say, similar type of exercise for social protection. You can do a similar type of exercise for some labor market policies. I think I'm out of time, right?
I think we need to start for discussion.
Yeah, let me just conclude with this. So let me summarize what the report says. The report says this is a time where we have opportunities, have changes in the world economy that significantly alter the nature of some of the challenges, some of the social and economic challenges we have. We have more resources, and we have a window of opportunity that has to do with the emergence of a middle class in developing countries, a middle class that looks very different from the middle class in the countries, in OECD countries. And so we have to find a new way of approaching them economically, but maybe also politically. And these new opportunities are not always shared, and therefore we need to actually continue reducing poverty. I think we're far from eradicating poverty, but also doing things in a way that is more shared. It's more shared in the outcomes, it's also more shared in the processes. Now, there are questions we didn't raise that maybe we'll raise today that I think are also important. In particular, how this makes a difference for worldwide governance. How this makes a difference for sustainability, the impacts that the environmental consequences of these changes actually have on people, both individually but also in collective and intergroup relations. And as I said at the beginning, our next step is to take this and see how we can incorporate some of these ideas into national development strategies. And for that, we're actually designing a set of analytical procedures and a methodology to look at country policies. And I'm very much looking forward to our discussions also to enrich that. Thanks.